Okay, so let us go into encountering the Mongols. So, what we're going to see is as we go through China and the Mongols, Persia and the Mongols, and Russia and the Mongols, take note and keep track of similarities and differences that you see in how the Mongols are going to treat each one of these groups of people, because they are definitely not going to be treated the same. So the Mongols in China, basically what they do is they adopt their culture, but they're not accepting of their people, which is kind of interesting. Ming China is going to unite after the Mongols rule. That was not helpful. So you're going to see the Mongols in China, you're going to see them forbid intermarriage. Um, that's not going to be super helpful. In China, you are going to see Emperor Kublai Khan. He is going to be the one that is going to be the emperor of the Mongols. Um, and he is going to embrace Confucianism, and that is going to stay. So once you see Emperor Yongle, who is part of the Ming Dynasty, you're going to see a unified China. Um, Emperor Yongle is going to create the encyclopedia. He is going to build the Forbidden City. He is going to construct the Temple of Heaven. And all of these things are going to unify China. And this is all going to be under the Ming Dynasty. Okay. Ming China, Emperor Yongle is one of the leaders of Ming China. Okay. And so this is going to be kind of a big deal. So under the Song in China, so these are different dynasties under the Mongols. Okay. Partly under the Mongols. So these different where the Mongols actually were interacting with them. So you're going to see the Song will be first, and we will see them. And they are going to try to unify a divided China. They're going to use Chinese administrative practices. They're going to use techniques for taxation, the postal system. We kind of discussed this just a little bit when we talked about Genghis Khan and them using taxation and administrative practices. Like I said, they were super meticulous in what they did. They're also going to give themselves the Mongols are going to give themselves Chinese dynastic titles, which they're going to act like they're part of a big dynasty like the Yuan, and they're going to embed themselves within Chinese history. So when we talk about some of the Chinese dynasties and Chinese history, some of that is actual Mongols, and since they did embed themselves, it's kind of difficult at times to differentiate between the Chinese history and the Mongol history because it's so intertwined. Marco Polo was in China at the time and noted that some of the Mongols treated Chinese like slaves, so they didn't treat them very well. The Mongols didn't become Chinese, they just adopted their culture. So here you have the Mongols enjoying Chinese culture, like they love the culture of it, but they don't like the people. I don't know if it's because they didn't come up with it or what, but they really enjoyed the culture of the Chinese. They're not treated very well, though. The Persia and the Mongols. So Persia, which is what you see right here, the Persian Empire, that's actually going to end up breaking apart after the Mongol rule. The Mongols basically convert to Islam in Persia. You are going to see assimilation. So you know how I said they liked the culture of China. It isn't that they like the culture of Persia. They actually want to become part of that culture. Okay, so here is what the Mongols learned from Persia, that bureaucracy was important. And so for them, the Mongols had an impeccable bureaucracy because the Mongols learned within Persian Empire because Persia had a great bureaucracy. And at the time, China wasn't quite as big on their bureaucracy. They will get there, but they weren't. And so what you see is this perfect bureaucracy that the Mongols are like, yeah, this is what they want. They do not mistreat the Persians. So when it comes to China and Persia, in Persia, the Mongols are eventually heavily integrated into Persian society, adopting Islam, the Persian language to some extent, and agricultural practices. Ultimately, when the Khanate declined, the Mongols did not leave like they did in China. So in China, when the Khanate declined, the Mongols departed. They don't do that in Persia. They stay, and they're actually assimilated into Persian society. In China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty purposefully maintained strict separation from their Chinese subjects. They wanted nothing to do with them as people, not their culture, but the people. And so when the dynasty fell, the Mongols returned to the steppes without any significant cultural assimilation. They actually did not keep Chinese culture at the time. They liked it, but they did not keep it. Whereas with Persia, they adopted it, kept it, and assimilated themselves into the culture. So Mongol rule in Persia, differing from that of China, what you see is you see a heavy taxation pushed Persian peasants off of their land, while Mongol herds of sheep and goats and Mongol neglect of fragile underground water channels did extensive damage to Persian agricultural land. They didn't do that in China. The Mongol rulers in Persia were transformed far more than their counterparts in China, as the Mongols made extensive use of the sophisticated Persian bureaucracy. So they basically destroyed a lot of the land of Persia. They did not do that in China. They transformed more into Persian culture than they did with Chinese culture. Unlike what occurred in China, the Mongols who conquered Persia converted in large numbers to the local Muslim faith. They did not convert to Buddhism. A number of Mongols turned to farming and married local people. Remember, that was in Persia. In China, they discouraged from intermarriage. So you can kind of see there's a big difference. They really didn't have a lot of respect for the Chinese, like they did the Persians. And now on to Russia. So when you see Russia, you're going to see they're going to adopt more of the Mongol culture than the other way around. So kind of interesting. It isn't that the Mongols are going to adopt Russian culture, but Russians are going to adopt Mongol culture. I don't know if that's because they didn't have a huge culture that was rooted in a lot of history like some of the other areas did. But this is what you see. Under Mongol rule, the Russian Orthodox Church is going to flourish because, again, the Mongols were religiously tolerant. You see that. They didn't directly rule. Russia had a lesser impact on them than the other places that they conquered. Mongols didn't stay there. They actually used some of the people there in Russia to rule for them. Russians are going to benefit the most because they've got all this power from the Mongols and they have all these ideas from the Mongols, and they're going to take that and they're going to use it. So Mongols had more of an impact on Russia than anywhere else. Other places, like with Persia, Mongols like embedded themselves into Persian culture. With dynasties, they kind of overlapped and it was kind of hard to see what was Mongol, what was Chinese when it came to ruling. But in Russia, they basically are going to be like, bring on the Mongol influence. And so you're going to see that a lot more. So here's the Golden Horde, the Empire of the Golden Horde in the year 835. Okay, so this is the size of this horde, this group, embedding a lot, very large area. So although the Mongols weren't influenced much by the Russians were very much influenced by the Mongols. They're going to adopt Mongol weapons, court practices, diplomatic rituals, taxation systems, and a military draft. They're going to have conscription, conscription is where you have to be a part of your military. Here is a picture of the Mongol invasion of Russia in Kievan Rus. When the Mongols invaded, it was bloody. It was not pretty. And obviously the Mongols did win out on that one. So, directly out of AP, compare and contrast the decline of Mongol rule in Russia with the decline of Mongol rule in China. In Russia, the end of Mongol rule came about because of the division of the Mongols between the Mongols, the disruptive influence of the plague, and the power of the local people. basically what that was were the Russian princes. So that's going to bring the end of Mongol rule. The divisions between the Mongols themselves, they ended up having their own internal conflict, the plague, and then Russian princes. In China, Mongol factionalism, the plague, and the power of local peoples also contributed to the end of the Yuan dynasty. So you're going to see similarities there where both had the plague, both had internal conflict, internal princedom or um, dynasties. Additionally, rapid rising prices along undermined Mongol rule in China, which Russia did not have that. There weren't rapidly rising prices. When we think, why were there rapidly rising prices in Russia? Well, that takes us right on back to the good old Silk Road. And they were more of a trade hub than Russia was. And so because of that, pricing impacted them more. And here is our lovely video over the Mongols.
Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. In this video, we fit to be talking about the Mongols. Now, thanks to John Green over at Crash Course, everybody loves the Mongols now. But if you had lived during their reign and you had resisted them, they would have given you the Black Plague, catapulted your dead, bulbous, oozing body over the defensive walls of their enemies in order to spread the plague to them and eviscerate their entire population. So back then, we wouldn't have bought t-shirts with the Mongols on them. We would have evacuated our bowels at the first sign of their approach. Even so, I admit, the Mongols are pretty awesome. Why does John Green always have to win? Doesn't matter, let's get to it. Now, over the course of world history, many pastoral peoples took the stage, but by far the most significant of them was the Mongols. The Mongols emerged in the 13th century and within only a few years controlled the largest land-based empire in all of human history. But what's strange is that even though what I just said is 100% true, the Mongol Empire itself left a very small cultural footprint on history. They gave us no new language, no new religion, and no lasting civilization. So let's get into all that they accomplished and how they accomplished it. And in order to do that, we need to start with one individual by the name of Temujin. And that name might not mean anything to you, but you might recognize him by the title he was given later in life, Genghis Khan. So Temujin was born in the 12th century into a network of Mongolian tribes that were fractured and at war with one another. And through a series of unfortunate events, Temujin and his family became social outcasts without much of a way to scratch a living. Even so, Temujin's personality was so magnetic, and he soon forged critical personal alliances among all the Mongolian tribes. Not long after that, he was recognized as a chief among his growing band of followers, and as such, he gained himself a reputation for brutality and ruthlessness with his enemies, and secured a healthy string of military victories. Now, one of the distinctive methods of his conquering is worth noting. In large part, instead of destroying his enemies or making them his slaves, he actually incorporated them into his own tribe. And on the wave of his growing power in 1206, a Mongolian tribal council named him Genghis Khan, the ruler of a newly unified Mongol nation. And just to be clear, historians of late have changed the spelling of his name to Chinggis Khan, so it's the same guy, just don't get confused. And so now that he was the Chinggis Genghis of all Mongolia and had a powerful army at his beck and call, what would he do? Well, I suppose he could have been satisfied in his accomplishments and sat on the porch of his yurt sipping yak milk for the rest of his life. But that's not what he did. So here's a life lesson for you. When a leader has supreme power and an army at its beck and call bent on destruction, you expand. Gotta have goals. And that's exactly what he did. Now, Genghis Khan's first leg of expansion was into China. In 1209, he perpetrated his first attack against the Chinese, and that set in motion the expansion of the Mongol world empire. And his attacks were fierce. A recent scholar said it this way: in a flash, the Mongol warriors would defeat every army, capture every fort, and bring down the walls of every city they encountered. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus would soon kneel before the dusty boots of illiterate young Mongol horsemen. And my question is, how could the Mongols, with a population of less than 1 million people, do such a thing? So let's try to answer that question. What tactics gave them the ability to conquer so many other people? Well, the first thing to note is that the Mongol Empire grew without a guiding blueprint. It's not like Chinggis sat down with a map and drew some lines and said, now that's my empire. No, they just went out and conquered, and the more people they conquered, the more resources resources they had to keep conquering. And in many cases, the odds were patently not in their favor. For example, when they invaded China, the Chinese population outnumbered the Mongols 100 to 1, and the Chinese possessed far more advanced technology. But in large part, the Mongol success lay in the organization of its army. Genghis Khan organized the entire Mongol society into military units of 10,000 and 1,000 and 110. And with such organization, he was able to quickly and effectively control and command his troops. And when he conquered a people, they got swept up into that organizational structure as well, except that he scattered them among different units so they wouldn't think about rebelling. And in this way, Genghis Khan created a growing army that was fiercely loyal to him, but not necessarily because they loved him, but because they feared him. In fact, his policy was that even if one member of a unit deserted, the whole unit was massacred. And this reputation for brutality actually did a lot of the work for him as it spread to the places where he was headed. His policy to those surrounding nations was as follows: whoever submits shall be spared, but those who resist, they shall be destroyed with their wives, children, and dependents. So obviously he was kind of a moderate, but despite those words, he actually did have a reputation for tolerance. Take religion, for example. Genghis Khan allowed people to keep their religion so long as their devotion to that religion did not become the center of political opposition. So wherever the Mongols encountered Christians or Buddhists or Muslims or Taoists, he largely let them be in terms of their beliefs. Now, we've been talking about Mongolian conquest in general, but let's look at how two specific cultures responded to them: China and Persia. The Mongol conquest of China was the most difficult and extended of all, and it lasted 70 years from 1209 to 1279. It began in northern China, and the Mongols' concern was destruction and plunder. But the further into China they moved, their concern changed. As they worked their way into southern China, they were more concerned with accommodating the local population. For example, they allowed landowners to keep their land as long as they pledged loyalty. Now, regardless of the different methods employed, the result of the conquest of China was the unification of China. In fact, some of the more learned Confucians were convinced that the Mongols had been given the mandate of heaven to rule over their people. And while they were in China, the Mongols fit pretty nicely into the Chinese mold by using existing systems of administration and taxation. They even established a new dynasty called the Yuan dynasty. And under the authority of this dynasty, roads were improved, canals were built, scholars and artists were patronized. So the Mongol leaders very much ruled like beneficent Confucian leaders. Even so, their rule in China was relatively brief, only about 100 years. By the mid-14th century, they were forced out by factionalism, numerous peasant rebellions, and the plague. Okay, that was China. Now let's see what happened when the Mongols encountered the Persians. This conquest was far more abrupt than the one in China. In relatively short order, the Muslim Persians fell to Mongol attacks, and to the Persians, this reality was deeply disconcerting. After all, the Mongols were infidels, and how in the world could a band of non-believers conquer them so easily? And not only did the Mongols conquer them, they slaughtered the Persians with a ferocity they had never known before. A Persian historian of the time recounted it like this: every town and every village has been several times subjected to pillage and massacre, and has suffered this confusion for years, so that even though there be generation and increase until the resurrection, the population will not attain to a tenth part of what it was before. In fact, in 1258, in the sacking of Baghdad, the Mongols put over 200,000 people to death. But what's interesting is that the Mongols were far more influenced by the Persians than the Persians were by the Mongols. They made use of the Persian administration system and left many Persian rulers in place. Most significant, though, is that the Mongols who conquered Persia became Muslim. This kind of large-scale conversion didn't happen when they conquered China. And as for the end of Mongol rule in Persia, it was much different than it was when they were driven out from China. In Persia, the Mongols just sort of disappeared gradually. Mainly, they just over time sort of assimilated into Persian culture, and eventually they found out that there was no more Mongols left. Okay, that's the Mongols. If you're trembling in your boots, you did it right. If this video was helpful to you, then...
Okay, so that is encountering the Mongols. We have one more section of this chapter and we'll be finished.